So tonight's program was really inspired by being on the oral history committee for Ohio Psychological Association. And with the pandemic happening, it really felt like a lot of history was happening in 2020. And we wanted to try to document some of it as it was happening. What are people experiencing and what are you feeling as you're going through this time? So, after talking with a few folks, I got really interested in this topic, particularly what the pandemic was like for different people, psychologists with disabilities and chronic illnesses, maybe some of our clients with those concerns. And I also was going through the Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology with APA and had to choose a project. So, this was a project that I was really interested in carrying out. And so I really appreciate our panel for joining us tonight. What we're going to talk about is what wisdom we can gain from 2020, particularly what can we learn about ableism from the pandemic. So I'm going to introduce our three panelists. I have a few questions for them. So that interview portion will be the first 30 minutes, and then I'll stop the recording and just open it up for a more informal discussion, Q&A, to see by the end of the hour what we can learn from each other. Okay. So we have some wonderful panelists. Dr. Angelakwemmel is a rehab psychologist in spinal cord injuries and disorders and the chair of the Psychology Service Diversity Committee at the Lewis Stokes Cleveland VA Med Center. She completed her pre-doc internship at VA Boston Harvard Med School and her postdoc fellowship in rehab psychology at the James A. Haley VA in Tampa, Florida. Dr. Kimmel is currently serving on APA's Council of Representatives and chairing APIC's Diversity Committee. In her 9 years at the Cleveland VAMC, Dr. Kimmel has pioneered a variety of interdisciplinary programs for veterans with spinal cord injuries and disorders, including telehealth, chronic pain management, and sexuality programs, a community education project on wheelchair accessibility, and an annual birthday party celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act. She's also very passionate about training future psychologists and actively pursues research and has published in supervision of students with disabilities. She was honored with ABAP's Early Career Diversity Award, a presidential citation from APA President Caslow, and the 2018 Division 22 Rehab Psychology Early Career Practice Award. In her free time, Dr. Kimmel enjoys staying up late to read the latest Jodi Picoult novel and cheering for the Green Bay Packers and Cleveland Cavaliers and Indians. So awesome. Thanks, Dr. Kimmel, for taking the time to join us tonight. Brittany Sommers works with me. She's a psychologist at the Cleveland State University's Counseling Center, where she offers individual and couples therapy, coordinates our group offerings, and provides training and supervision. She also sees clients at a group practice in Beechwood, Ohio, which specializes in treating sexual concerns. Her clinical interests include emotion regulation, mood disorders, relational concerns, non-suicidal self-injury, sexuality, and trauma. She's conducted research on the topics of distress tolerance, self-injurious behaviors, and religious identity formation. She is chair of Ohio Psych Association's Early Career Committee and is president of the Cleveland Psychological Association. Great. And then Dr. Rebecca Wilbur was in Ohio for a brief stint at the VA here. She is now a licensed psychologist with specialized training in neuropsychology and rehabilitation psychology. She currently works at Legacy Good Samaritan Medical Center in the Rehabilitation Institute of Oregon, or RIO, an acute interdisciplinary rehabilitation unit. In addition to her work at RIO, she writes and publishes peer-reviewed articles on her research regarding supervising trainees with disabilities. In addition, she's given many national presentations on this topic in an effort to raise awareness, advocate for, and support supervisors and psychology trainees with disabilities. So thanks very much, Dr. Sommers, Dr. Kimmel, Dr. Wilbur, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your sharing as psychologists and also in a personal way as psychologists with disabilities and chronic illnesses to kind of bridge that gap between personal and professional. So I appreciate that tremendously. So I have 4 questions. You don't all have to answer each one, but I'm going to start my way through and we're interested to hear your thoughts on these questions. So the first question is, when the pandemic was first declared, which was about 11 months ago, it was the first time for many people that health had such an impact on their daily lives. What were some of your reactions at the time, and what did you hear from other folks with disabilities at that time?
Okay, so this is Angela Kimmel. I'm happy to answer first. So when I first thought back to March of last year, when this all kind of broke out, I remember one of the first sort of reactions I had was fear, both for myself as an individual with a disability, and how was this going to impact me having a compromised immune system. How is it going to impact the care that I'm dependent on from caregivers? And then also, I'm really passionate about my work, as you saw in my bio. So, how was that going to continue? And would I be able to get disability accommodations to keep myself safe? And then also for the veteran population, working at the VA on spinal cord injury, what could I do to help the veterans, also feel safe, and figure out how they would continue to get their needs met.
This is Brittany Sommers. I think a lot of my reactions initially felt similar to other people, like some of the uncertainty or health fear or disappointment over things canceled or trying to transition work. But one of the pieces that felt a little bit less shared when I was talking with others was that I noticed more anger than I'm used to. And some of the places that I noticed that were things like I was so excited that, remote work was becoming available and more accessible, but I was also holding that I had been denied those things as a reasonable accommodation when I needed them throughout schooling, or the idea that as having an immune deficiency, it's always helpful when other people wash their hands, and the idea that as soon as this impacts able-bodied people, we're willing to do it in a way that we weren't before. And so that was one of the things that stood out just as a little bit different, as I was like, I'm in this with a lot of other people, and something feels a little bit different about my reaction. I also think, so I guess the pandemic, none of us could predict how it would play out, but the disability activists that I follow and am in contact with had been talking about this since at least end of December. And so it was a little bit striking to me in March when it was like, oh, now you're listening. And so I held some of that reaction as well.
I had kind of a similar reaction to Brittany, and that, there were some things that didn't change for me. Certainly by nature of having an autoimmune disorder, I've always been a careful hand washer, and I've always been kind of labeled as a germaphobe, and so many of the behaviors that others were having to adjust to were things that I had been doing for all of my life. So there was this little bit of, oh, yeah, now you think that's important, similar to what Dr. Sommers was just mentioning. And, so it was a little bit interesting that way, but what some of the reactions that I did hear from others, for me, in my daily work, it was really just becoming more and more conscious about using, personal protective equipment, because I work in an inpatient unit, and we've been open throughout the entire pandemic. I'm one of the few who does not work remotely and haven't the entire time. We're also one of the only units that's remained open in this particular hospital because of the nature of what we do. So, in some ways, there hasn't been a lot of change in that daily routine, but I am close with many other people with different types of disabilities, and there's been a lot of challenges for other psychologists and other people who I've known and who I've worked with, For some of them, the transition going to telehealth was great, and that went smoothly. But for others who had different types of compromised immune system, they weren't receiving some of the accommodations that they needed, even though it was something that was clearly documented and something that was, possible. It wouldn't necessarily be easy for some of the parties involved, but it would be possible to do it. And so it was kind of strange that there was this kind of duality between the rest of the world kind of catching up with a lot of some of the safety practices that I had been doing most of my life, and them, being like, oh, this is such a burden. Oh, my hands are so raw. And I'm like, yeah, welcome too. But there was also kind of this duality with some people needing accommodations and then being denied. So that it was, so there were, I think, a lot of different emotions that kind of came up with that when the pandemic was really first declared, and it really started becoming a part of everybody's daily life.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And I think that segues into my next question is, what dilemmas have you faced related to workplace issues during the pandemic, and how have you navigated those?
So for me, one of the first things that I thought about was, safety, and could I get an accommodation to work from home and telework. I was really lucky that I worked in a setting that was really accommodating to me, and telehealth was a huge part of my practice before. So for me, the transition went pretty smoothly. Something that was really interesting to me, though, was for the first time, several individuals, in particular with invisible disability, or especially with the compromised immune systems, had never needed disability accommodations before. And so I got a couple calls and people wanting consultation on, am I an individual with a disability and can I qualify for this? And there was also a lot of fear about, especially when the economy was hit, about would asking for a disability accommodation jeopardize my job? I know one person in particular was very fearful about asking for anything in additional in the workplace, for fear of, bringing up a lot of feelings about disability seen as less than, being seen as not capable. And it was just really interesting to see different individuals that I knew grappling with this whole concept of disability identity.
Sounds like too the pandemic seemed to kind of force um, taking on of the disability identity and then coming out as having a disability at work when they otherwise would not have.
That piece of disclosure is something that I've thought about a lot throughout, because with an invisible disability, something that affords me that others don't have is sometimes some choice in terms of when I disclose or don't. And right now, if I'm in a situation where I'm being very cautious about something and people are pushing back, if I say, oh, well, I have an immune deficiency, there's almost like an immediate acceptance, which I appreciate, but I wish that acceptance was there without the disclosure. And so it's been this push and pull of like, well, if I say this, then I'm disclosing, but it almost feels forced in some situations. Like one of the dilemmas I faced was I was part of planning an event with a professional group that I was advocating for canceling early in the pandemic. And responses were, I think you're being a little hysterical. I think it's a little too soon to do that. But I knew as soon as I said, well, I'm not comfortable with it because of this, it would be more accepted. But I would have liked to see like the organization as a whole reach that conclusion without that disclosure. Thankfully, I've been in work settings that have mostly moved to remote work anyway and have been very accommodating, that I'm really grateful for. So I've had safety and privilege in that regard.
So in terms of work for myself, dilemmas that I've faced, and this will also, I think, segue into the next question somewhat, but in order to manage my particular disability with having a compromised immune system and some of the inflammation and pain that I experience, there's certain practices that I do to try to manage pain that involve like certain types of exercise and routine and activity. And this is may sound strange, but actually when the gyms closed, that became an issue for me. It actually became a problem because I didn't have access to some of the similar routine and activity and exercise that I was accustomed to. And while I tried to adapt to doing different types of exercise at home, what I first started was something like walking my neighborhood and kind of power walk through. But the problem was that ended up becoming too much of a high impact. And I ended up between that and frankly a lot of stress that was going on in relation to the pandemic. I had one of the worst rheumatoid arthritis flares that I've had since I was first diagnosed, and both my knees like basically blew out. I ended up having to take off work for a week. It was extremely difficult to get in to see a specialist. I couldn't even get in to go see my own primary care doctor. I ended up, like I said, taking a week off from work. There was a lot of, my supervisor wanted me to use FMLA, which ended up becoming very challenging because you have to have certain pieces of documentation from medical providers to be able to justify that, even though all that did was take out of my bank of personal leave anyway. So it sort of felt like all this extra stress and paperwork on top of an already stressful and painful situation. You know, that navigating that, I mean, ultimately I was able to see my primary care doctor remotely, who was able to get me on the right medication, and I was able to get treated and go back to work. But the process of it was so many more times magnified in terms of the stress level, in terms of the kind of the breakdown that has been long since ongoing in our medical system with being able to get people services. And I'm a person who's pretty much coming from a place of privilege, and it was still very difficult for me to be able to be seen and to be able to get the treatment that I needed. And it was directly impacting my ability to work. I'm in a position where I am in the hospital kind of frontline worker. So that really became one of the main challenges that I was navigating that directly impacted me in respect to the pandemic.
Yeah. Ooh, so I'm really hearing there things I haven't heard before as much around being able to manage your condition during the pandemic and get the treatment you need, and then a threat to even being able to work because of all that kind of piling on. Yeah. So the next question, that is a great segue in terms of like, how has the pandemic affected you differently, or the response to it affected you differently than it has affected people without disabilities?
So one thing that came to mind when thinking about this question is, in my day-to-day functioning prior to the pandemic, I had really found a lot of ways to compensate for my disability so that it limited my life as little as possible. And when the pandemic struck, all of a sudden I had to be even more vigilant. And there are definitely some people that I know and associated with prior to the pandemic who were not taking the precautions as seriously and still wanted to carry on in a similar manner that we had prior to the pandemic. And, to really sort of, so in that way, being vigilant and focusing on my own health and safety, it was sort of like stigmatizing and almost like separating. I remember talking with another friend who has a chronic illness and was also being incredibly vigilant. And, some other friends of ours had wanted to go out and carry on in a way, do an activity that we all would have engaged in pre-pandemic. And, she said to me, like, I want so badly to be able to go out and do the things we used to do. But I can't. I have to be careful, and I really have to focus on my health, because I could face serious consequences of doing this. And so for me, just thinking about, there was a huge difference for me, just really having to be vigilant, and, my health and my disability really sort of separated me in ways that it hadn't before the pandemic.
Keep with the same order here, I think, and jump in. Yeah, so as I think about what's felt different, there are certainly, like, one of the impacts for me has been like disruptions to supply chain in terms of some medical infusions I get and the supplies needed for that. So that started to take up like more headspace than it sometimes does. I think, like Angela was alluding to, I kind of had it as down to science as I could beforehand, and then all of a sudden all the pieces were interrupted. Though, I have privilege of having really good health insurance, so I've seen it play out a lot better than it has for a lot of people I'm in community with that also have disabilities. But my sense, as I think about my experience and talk about my experience with peers, and as I hear from disabled clients, is that it's felt a little bit more like the narrative around the pandemic has felt more personalized than maybe it does for others. I think most of my friends are 30-ish, and I hear a lot of, well, I'm taking precaution, but I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about, I'm doing this for X person or Y person, or they're not taking precaution. And so for me, it's a lot more personalized. And when you hear like high-level doctors saying they're reassured that only the elderly or those with pre-existing conditions are dying, like that has personal impact. Or all the references to like, don't worry, like you're young and healthy. Well, that's a really big assumption for me. And so I think that's had a little bit more impact than maybe for peers, which I know there are other areas where I don't attend a narrative in nearly the same way that it would probably be beneficial to. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. Sommers on that one. The narrative, I think, has been one of the most. It's certainly something that's been in my awareness, I think, throughout, and unto itself becomes another layer of burden and challenge, and another layer of stress that ends up being added to a challenging time. And I think that exactly what Dr. Sommers was just saying, and I think Dr. Kimmel was also saying, was, the pandemic really took away a lot of the resources that I was using to manage my condition in so many ways, because, there's so many different aspects of managing our health, and certainly social is another part of it. But having fewer resources certainly increased the stress for me, for a combination of things that led to a serious flare, which, certainly affected me physically and emotionally. I mean, that level of pain is challenging to deal with, and something that I normally would use my resources and tools to be able to manage, so that I could kind of carry on my life at a fairly high level. And I think that impact is it adds an extra layer of complexity that being a member of this particular minority group just changes the dynamic in another way that not everybody can recognize or can appreciate in the way that people with disabilities experience it.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm learning a lot already, and you don't have to answer this question if you don't want to, but the final question for the panel is what strengths or resiliency might be more evident for people with disabilities at this time?
So for me, when I thought about that question, just sort of like what is one of the good things to come out of this pandemic, is so a hope that I have is, so many of us have become accustomed to telework, and this could have been a quality of life improver for people with disabilities. Like, for example, I was consulted by a student applying for internship with a chronic fatigue issues. And she was really concerned about how, without traveling to a hospital for an internship interview, how would she gauge how much walking she had to do and if the site would work for her. And one of the things I suggested was think about asking or keeping in mind an accommodation for telework a few days a week. And because we had to find a way to make telework work, I'm hoping that this can improve quality of life for people with disabilities once we emerge from the pandemic. For me personally, even the extra time and the improvement in my own energy level. There were days where I found myself thinking like, gosh, telework would have been great before the pandemic, when I could have enjoyed all the extra things I could have done with the extra time I had on my hands and the extra energy. I don't think I realized how much it took out of me just to get to work in the morning. So something that I'm hopeful is that this can be something that people with disabilities can use post-pandemic, to help improve quality of life.
Yeah, I had a similar thought as I was thinking about strengths, or what I am hopeful might come out of this is more of these accessibility pieces that have now been piloted and normalized in ways that they might not have been before. I also think there's some visibility that's happened that I'm glad for. Like, I saw a headline on a major news network yesterday about individuals with immune deficiencies, which is not usually something I come across. So I'm hoping that will linger and have some impact. Then as I thought about strengths, I thought about the idea that I think for a lot of individuals with disabilities, we're pretty used to adjusting to unpredictable health situations. Like, I know that I pivot if pain is worse or something like that each day. And so, or maybe hours of medical advocacy are needed some day or some week, and you just kind of adjust and pivot. And I think that's what's being asked of us, globally right now. And so I think disabled people are well positioned to lead some of this right now. And I'm glad for some of the spaces in which we are, because I think that's a strength we bring to the situation.
I agree. I really hope that we're able to carry forward a lot of lessons that we've learned from this experience. I think that the world in many ways was kind of forced to learn how to accommodate. And I think that those some very powerful lessons were learned, and we were able to find flexibility that before no one thought all of us could do, but we found it. And I'm really hoping that we're able to carry that wisdom forward because there is so much more that we're all capable of being able to do. And really, it is kind of distilling down what are the essential functions of whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. What are the true essential functions? Like Dr. Kimmel was mentioning about the student applying for an internship site that may have required a lot of walking. You know, is walking an essential function of a psychologist? Is that what makes a psychologist? No, that's not an essential function. We can do so much that have to do with, you know, emotion and cognition and behavior, and that's where we have our essential functions, not in our movement. So I really hope that this has taught all of us across certainly the United States and hopefully across the world, different ways of being able to look at things and allowing for more mental flexibility and really kind of distilling things down in terms of what is really essential and what can we accommodate, where can we find flexibility. You know, and I think also what Dr. Sommers was saying about, you know, we've kind of all had to do, those of us with different types of disabilities have often had to find resiliency and strength all along in different ways. And now the rest of the world has been challenged in this way. And, you know, it's been certainly a challenging time and a stressful time, but it also has helped me develop more hope that we can find a way forward. And this, you know, maybe on the other side of it, we'll be able to be more united. And that is my hope for all of this.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Great. Well, it's been a pleasure to have all of you here, and thank you so much. I know Dr. Sommers, Dr. Kimmel, and Dr. Wilbur are incredibly busy, and it was just an honor to have you sharing from your personal stories as well as your professional lives. I think it's enriched us all. So.